Uncontrolled despotism. That's what the Anti-Federalists warned we'd get. Look all around. We live under the largest government in history, and every branch of government has been violating the Constitution for decades. Plus, we've got a tax code that would make King George blush. They understood what most people today refuse to admit. Power never limits itself. And vague words in constitutions? They're little more than blank checks for tyrants. The Anti-Federalists, they saw exactly how the Republic would die from within. So on this episode, how they called it on 5 specific mechanisms. The 5 horsemen of tyranny. But first of all, before getting to that, welcome, and thank you for joining me here on the Path to Liberty. My name is Michael Bolden with the 10th Amendment Center, and this is the show for Friday, July 11th, 2025. Let's get right to it, because I think George Mason, he fired the first shots, and really he may be considered the first anti-federalist because he was drafting his objections. He wrote down some notes of his objections to the proposed Constitution while still at the Philadelphia Convention before it was even finalized and sent to the states for ratification. And in his published version of this, November in 1787, he put it like this: "This government will set out a moderate aristocracy." So right off the bat, he thought, exactly right out of the gates, we're going to get an aristocracy. He said, "It is at present impossible to foresee whether it will, in its operation, produce a monarchy or a corrupt, tyrannical aristocracy. It will most probably vibrate some years between the two and then terminate in one or the other." And when we're thinking about these 5 mechanisms of tyranny, it all starts with Congress. And Cato warned about how powers delegated to the federal government and heavily to Congress were vague and by design. He said inexplicitness seems to pervade this whole political fabric. And being vague, of course, is bad enough in a constitution. But as Elbridge Gerry warned, some of the powers delegated to Congress were actually going to lead to all kinds of unlimited power. He said some of the powers of the legislature are ambiguous and others indefinite and dangerous. And if you're like me, you're probably immediately thinking of a handful of clauses that are vague or unlimited or indefinite and dangerous. First of all, a great example is the General Welfare Clause, one of the most twisted and abused and misused in modern times. Brutus, in his 6th paper, he warned that it would end up being a blank check, a power to do basically anything and everything. He said to provide for the general welfare is an abstract proposition, which mankind differ in the explanation of as much as they do on any political or moral proposition that can be proposed. So he's concerned that you're putting a phrase in here to provide for the general welfare, but that's not easily defined. And he explained how that would play out. He said the most opposite measures may be pursued by different parties, and both may profess that they have in view the general welfare. And both sides may be honest in their professions, or probably the more common one, that's my ad, both may have sinister views. And then, of course, Brutus points out that it gets worse, and this is from his previous paper, the 5th one. You tie in the necessary and proper clause, and now Congress can basically do whatever it wants, whenever they want. He said the inference is natural that the legislature will have an authority to make all laws which they shall judge necessary for the common safety and to promote the general welfare. So people often think of clauses like general welfare, commerce, necessary and proper, declare war, and problems of just the clause itself. But he recognized that when you tie them together with necessary and proper, it just takes it to a whole nother level. He said this amounts to a power to make laws at discretion. And if you understand the principles of the American Revolution, it wasn't just about, they weren't fighting a long, bloody war in order to get representatives who could tax them, that was just an outgrowth of the British claim to power in the Declaratory Act in all cases whatsoever. That's to make laws at discretion, unlimited power. He continued, no terms can be found more indefinite than these. And it is obvious that the legislature alone must judge what laws are proper and necessary for the purpose. And now what are they going to do with all that undefined and unlimited power? Well, governments don't generally use tons of power to protect your liberty. And of course, having tons of power is contrary to you actually having liberty. But of course, as Elbridge Gerry pointed out, they were going to use this kind of power, these vague, undefined terms, to bleed us dry with taxes. And that's how he put it. The people will bleed with taxes at every pore, and that the existence of their liberties will soon be terminated. Luther Martin took it further with this comparison of the taxing power to economic bloodletting. We'd get tax after tax after tax until nothing is left to take. He wrote, it will, by the imposition of the variety of taxes, imposts, stamps, excises, and other duties, squeeze from them the little money they may acquire, the hard earnings of their industry, as you would squeeze the juice from an orange, till not a drop more can be extracted. And then he didn't even stop there. He warned that they would keep going until they would drain you without limit and without mercy. He said they would tax you to whatever amount they choose, and thus to sluice them at every vein, as long as they have a drop of blood without any control, limitation, or restraint. And it's hard to really emphasize what a big deal this is, because these guys were calling it well over a century before the 16th Amendment and the so-called individual income tax. Imagine what they'd say today. Anyways, I covered the anti-federalist warnings about the taxing power even before the individual income tax over a century in an episode earlier this year that will be linked to in the show notes. Now, some people, of course, will tell us, well, that the independent judiciary is going to keep Congress in check. I mean, sure, okay. And they would say things like that back then, too. Okay, yeah, maybe Congress is going to go beyond their limits, but you have the judiciary to also keep them in check. But Patrick Henry had something to say about that as well. If you rely on part of the federal government to keep the federal government in check, well, the results are going to be really, really bad. You won't have any protection at all. He said they cannot serve two masters struggling for the same object. This, instead of relieving or aiding me, deprives me of my only comfort, the independency of the judges. He said the judiciary are the sole protection against the tyrannical execution of laws. But if by this system we lose our judiciary and they cannot help us, we must sit down quietly and be oppressed. Now, of course, the danger with the judicial branch to the Anti-Federalists, it went much deeper than bias or mere corruption, I guess we could say. Unknowable, unchecked, unlimited power. That's the warning that we got from Mercy Otis Warren in her great pamphlet From a Columbian Patriot in the early part of 1788. She said, there are no well-defined limits of the judiciary powers. They seem to be left as a boundless ocean that has broken over the chart of the supreme lawgiver. Thus far shalt thou go, and no farther. And she continued, and as they cannot be comprehended by the clearest capacity or the most sagacious mind, I struggle on that one, it would be an Herculean labor to attempt to describe the dangers with which they are replete. Brutus predicted that the judiciary would expand its own power, and then, on top of it, it would use its own expansion of power as a precedent to expand its power even more. He wrote, when the courts will have a precedent before them of a court which extended its jurisdiction in opposition to an act of the legislature, is it not to be expected that they will extend theirs? He said, this power in the judicial will enable them to mold the government into almost any shape they please. Man, that one sure sounds familiar, doesn't it? And Elbridge Gerry, he summed up the anti-federalist position on the judicial branch in just 6 short words. The judicial department will be oppressive. Now, of course, the anti-federalists weren't just concerned about Congress and the courts. They knew that one man with enough power could wreck the entire system and destroy liberty. As Cato put it, this is where the president comes in. He said and of course the entire executive branch, all connected. The deposit of vast trusts in the hands of a single magistrate enables him in their exercise to create a numerous train of dependents. This tempts his ambition, kind of like the deep state of today. They were looking at as like the courts of the royals of old. He therefore, Cato wrote, fancies that he may be great and glorious by oppressing his fellow citizens and raising himself to permanent grandeur on the ruins of his country. Now, as a quick aside, for those of you who are kind of familiar with George Washington's farewell address from 1796, you can go out there and look it up and read it. You're going to find very similar language to what Cato had to say right there, but Washington tied it into the danger of factions. Anyways, back to Cato. He also saw a lot of danger in a president who basically surrounds himself with cronies. He said the great powers of the president, connected with his duration in office, would lead to oppression and ruin. He would be governed by favorites and flatterers, or that a dangerous council would be collected from the great officers of state. I just keep thinking, man, this is exactly what we've lived under our entire lives. He said this 10-mile square of the Capitol would be the asylum of the base, idle, avaricious, and ambitious. And it keeps getting worse. The bigger the country, Brutus warned, the more lawless these people would be. He said, in so extensive a republic, the great officers of government would soon become above the control of the people and abuse their power to the purpose of aggrandizing themselves and oppressing them. And Luther Martin saw the final step. A president with the power to handpick his own loyalists, his team, his cabinet, his cronies, would be a king in everything but the name. He said, it was said that the person who nominates will always in reality appoint, and that this was giving the president a power and influence with which, together with the other powers bestowed upon him, would place him above all restraint or control. In fine, it was urged that the president as here constituted was a king in everything but the name. Now, despite assurances and promises from Alexander Hamilton that this could never happen, there's nothing to worry about, Patrick Henry gave us the brutal truth. He said, your president may easily become king. It wouldn't be difficult to Patrick Henry at all. And he didn't stop at theory. If you give one man an army and a taste of power, you've just given him the tools that he needs for complete despotism. He said, if your American chief be a man of ambition and abilities, how easy is it for him to render himself absolute? The army, of course, is in his hands. And if he be a man of address, it will be attached to him. And it will be the subject of long meditation with him to seize the first auspicious moment to accomplish his design. Now, I know I am just powering through a lot of original source documents and quotes and information here, and I'm going through it pretty quickly. But my hope is that this episode serves as a bit of a highlight reel for you and encourages you to do a little bit more research and self-education a little bit later on. And if you're that kind of person, well, you're in luck because the TAC's got your back. Every single episode, we publish a blog post for the episode. Alan Mosley does a great job, very timely and consistent, so reliable. I love him. I'm very grateful for the work that he does, and he's pretty cool to hang out with, too, whenever I get a chance every few years in person. Way overdue on that. Anyways, Alan gets the blog post organized. At the top of it, you're going to see all the different platforms we're on. Of course, all the video platforms, the audio-only podcast platforms. But just below that, there's a show links section. And if I do a good job with my notes that I give to Alan, then he's going to have them generally in the order that I go through the references in each episode. That way you can read, learn more in context on your own time. So Alan will get that organized, and I will get that published a couple of hours after this live stream is done, over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty. It's all spelled out, 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty. So let's get back to it. And this brings us to the fourth mechanism of tyranny, enforcement itself. Brutus here in his first paper, he warned that government power always finds the muscle that it needs to back it up. He said, and of course, it's the type and approach. They focus heavily on force. He said, in despotic governments, as well as in all the monarchies of Europe, standing armies are kept up to execute the commands of the prince or the magistrate, and are employed for this purpose when occasion requires. But they have always, not sometimes, always proved the destruction of liberty and are abhorrent to the spirit of a free republic. And the Pennsylvania Anti-Federalists, they put out a dissent with almost 24 people signing on to it. They knew where this leads. A standing army would be a battering ram for tyranny. They wrote, a standing army in the hands of a government placed so independent of the people may be made a fatal instrument to overturn the public liberties. It may be employed to enforce, think of what they're going to do with it. They're going to use this tool of force to do what they want to do. Collect taxes, rip you off, basically. It may be employed to enforce the collection of the most oppressive taxes and to carry into execution the most arbitrary measures. And if you think about arbitrary measures, those are measures that are not authorized by the Constitution. They're just arbitrary power. That was what the Declaration of Independence was all about. And if you use a standing army to do that, you're basically the British. They said, an ambitious man who may have the army at his devotion may step up into the throne and seize upon absolute power. Now, whenever I talk about the founding generation and their opposition to large, permanent standing armies, and this was not just the Anti-Federalists, all across the spectrum, there's a handful that weren't totally opposed to standing armies, but at best, generally the best view was, well, they're always dangerous to liberty, but we got to have them a little bit. We got to have the ability to have them. They were all in favor, even like General Henry Knox, the first Secretary of War under George Washington, specifically said, a militia, an energetic national militia, is the capital security of a free republic and not a standing army. But whenever I talk about these positions, we get a lot of comments saying, well, the real standing army we got to worry about is the nationalized police force, whether it's militarized federal agencies or local police that are being funded and militarized by the federal government. And I would actually just say, well, the standing army is the standing army that the founders warned us about. But this police force, this nationwide police state that we live under, is also another kind of a de facto standing army that the founders did warn us about. And I covered that in some detail in an episode almost 3 years ago. I guess this is getting old school at this point. Militarized federal agencies, the other standing army, that will be in the show notes over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty. Now back to Mercy Otis Warren. She saw where this would all lead. Basically, how they'd use even the militia for oppression to expand power both at home and abroad. And again, this sounds very familiar. She said they may either be employed to extort the enormous sums that will be necessary to support the civil list, to maintain the regalia of power and the splendor of the most useless part of the community. I love that. The most useless part of the community are the people with power, the politicians, I think. That's how I'm reading it. But she continued, or they may be sent into foreign countries for the fulfillment of treaties stipulated by the president and 2/3 of the Senate. Now that brings us to the fifth, and I guess really the fatal mechanism, the fatal flaw. The Anti-Federalists warned us over and over and over that the whole system, because of these vague clauses and undefined powers, not clearly defined, that would lead to unlimited power. The whole system then, if you wanted to have liberty, would rely on trust. Trust the system, trust the plan. The plan would make sure only the best of the best rose to the top. And then through the system, it would all be kept in control through the checks and balances. But Cato felt that this was a pretty bad move. He said, you are about to precipitate yourselves into a sea uncertainty and adopt the system so vague and which has discarded so many of your valuable rights. Is it because you do not believe that an American can be a tyrant? If this be the case, you rest on a weak basis. And Cato warned that Americans in this regard, they aren't special. They're like everyone else on earth. And tyranny here in America would be just as possible as it was in ancient Rome. He said Americans are like other men in similar situations. Students of history look at history and say, well, if you had this scenario and it played out like this, well, you shouldn't be surprised if, even though history doesn't repeat, it often rhymes. So Americans, he said, are like other men in similar situations. Your posterity, us, will find that great power connected with ambition, luxury, and flattery will as readily produce a Caesar, Caligula, Nero, and Domitian in America as the same causes did in the Roman Empire. And no one put this issue of trust in better terms than old Abraham White. That was the Honorable Old Abraham White in the Massachusetts Ratifying Convention, who said he wouldn't trust a flock of Moseses. And each one of these 5 mechanisms, they all point to the same fatal direction: consolidation or centralization of power. And Patrick Henry called it. He said, dangers are to be apprehended in whatever manner we proceed, but those of a consolidation are the most destructive. So the Lion of Liberty, Patrick Henry, he said the worst thing to be concerned with if you're worried about your liberty is consolidation or centralization of power. Now, for the Pennsylvania Anti-Federalists, let me pull them back up here, this wasn't even a flaw. They thought that consolidation was an intentional design. They weren't alone. I'll get to another in just a moment. They said, in short, consolidation pervades the whole Constitution. It begins with an enunciation that such was the intention. And of course, they're pointing to the preamble. And they say it begins with the words, "We, the people of the United States," which is the style of a compact between individuals entering into a state of society, and not that of a confederation of states. So it's not a union of states when you started out with "we the people." That's the argument that they're making here. Patrick Henry made a very similar one. Now, for George Mason, this is one of the first speeches in the Virginia Ratifying Convention, maybe number 1. It's June 4th, 1788, I believe is the date. He thought that the taxing power alone, again, more than a century before the 16th Amendment and the individual direct income tax, he thought the taxing power in the body of the Constitution, like the General Welfare Clause, was enough to give us this dreaded consolidation on its own. He said the assumption of this power of laying direct taxes does of itself entirely change the confederation of the states into one consolidated government. Just that, all on its own, you'd have consolidation. What Patrick Henry, his friend, warned was the most dangerous thing. Mason continued, the very idea of converting what was formerly confederation to a consolidated government is totally subversive of every principle which has hitherto governed us. And for the federal farmer, he was another one who felt that the entire system was intentionally designed to look like it wasn't going to lead that way, partially national, partially federal, but it was absolutely going to end in consolidation. He said the plan of government now proposed is evidently calculated to change in time our condition as a people. So he saw this as well. If you tie it in with vague powers aren't going to be used to go from, well, we want limited delegated, expressly delegated powers to anything and everything. It would take time over years. Even James Otis Jr. during the American Revolution said, a free government, and by their term free government, they meant one that was rules made by the people and government followed those rules. It would never degenerate into a tyranny all at once. It's the work of years. So the same kind of messaging from the great principles of the American Revolution, federal farmers using this as well. He's seeing the powers delegated and saying, well, this vague stuff, well, over time, it's going to totally change our condition as a people. Instead, he said, of being 13 republics under a federal head, it is clearly designed to make us one consolidated government. And Patrick Henry knew this would be a death sentence for liberty. He said consolidation must end in the destruction of our liberties. The Anti-Federalists weren't alarmists. They weren't conspiracy theorists. They were students of history. And Mercy Otis Warren saw exactly where things would lead. She said the ratification of a constitution, which by the undefined meaning of some parts and the ambiguities of expression in others, is dangerously adapted to the purposes of an immediate aristocratic tyranny. And then it gets worse, that from the difficulty, if not impracticability of its operation, must soon terminate in the most uncontrolled despotism. The Anti-Federalists warned us. We have not listened to them. And if we ever want to turn things around from the largest government in history to a real land of the free, we can't afford to ignore them any longer. Now, unfortunately, because of the government-run and government-approved so-called education system, which does a terrible job, it doesn't teach anyone any of this stuff. None of these deep principles. You never hear one side. If anything, you're going to just hear like, oh, the Anti-Federalists, they were basically losers. They lost. They wanted a Bill of Rights, and that was basically it. And they got it. So we can celebrate them for that. But we never actually hear about the deeper principles. And that's a big part of the reason why we work so hard every single day here at the 10th Amendment Center to reach and teach more and more people about this essential, forgotten, and ignored history. And nothing helps us do this work more than the financial faith and support of our members. If you got a couple of bucks of that quickly devaluing dirty government fiat, please consider throwing it our way over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/members. Like all the other URLs I mentioned, it's all spelled out. 10thamendmentcenter.com/members. Our membership program starts out at just $2 a month. We also have annual, 5-year, and lifetime options. Again, 10thamendmentcenter.com/members. And if you don't want to become a member, but you still want to help us out financially, I still love you. Whatever works for you works great for me. Or if you already are a member, I'm very grateful for that, of course, and you want to pitch in a little additional, I want to make sure you know where you can do that. It's 10thamendmentcenter.com/donate. And as a reminder, whether you want to pitch in financially or not, that's awesome. I'm glad you're here. But if you want to help us spread the word, if you found this episode educational, interesting, if you learned something, any of that, if you liked it, if it was fun, please consider taking a few actions that can trigger algorithms and tell them to show us to more people, whether it's hitting the like button, leaving a comment in the archive, reviews on any of the podcast platforms, subscribe, get notifications. I'm trying to think of all these things. Watch time percentage on YouTube is a huge one. So if you watch 10 minutes of a 10-minute video, that's 100%. But if you watch 30 minutes, that's 300%. And that's way, way better. And I really, really appreciate any level of support, whether it's financial, otherwise, combination of all the above. thank you so much. Thank you so much for spending some of your time with me today. I really appreciate you being here. Again, I hope this was interesting. I hope it was entertaining maybe a little bit here and there, but more important than anything, I hope it was educational. I hope it made you think. I hope you learned something. Thanks again for watching the show or listening to the show. Hope you have an awesome weekend, and I look forward to seeing you next week here on the Path to Liberty.